Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of Pale Saints, another English group that came out of the late 80s and left some very significant contributions to the worlds of shoegaze, dream pop, and alternative rock. And as is the case with all of those genres, every band has their own interpretations and flavors that they put into those styles, and Pale Saints is one of those groups that I think had a truly unique sound, and you never knew what you were going to get from them from one album to the next, which makes for a very fun discography to explore. So what I'm going to do today is go through their 3 studio albums and their 4 EPs. Normally when I make these videos, I try to stick to only studio albums because I feel like the experience of listening to an EP as opposed to a full studio album are two completely different types of listening experiences, and it does feel weird sometimes comparing studio albums to EPs. But since their studio discography is so small, I figured I might as well throw in their 4 EPs as well. So I'm going to start out with Barging into the Presence of God and go up to Slow Buildings, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album and EP, and I'll let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 3 albums and 4 EPs. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut EP from 1989 titled Barging into the Presence of God, and this one gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible first EP to put out. It delivers 3 amazing tracks that are all tasteful and very dynamic and show us the different musical territories that the band is dabbling in throughout this early process of finding their sound. It opens up with Sight of You, which is a beautiful track that kicks things off in a more upbeat but dreamy indie pop sort of vibe. An incredible song and the perfect opener to their first EP. Then it changes gears with She Rides the Waves, and it takes us into some more noise pop territories with very tasteful and colorful vocal melodies and chord progressions. And this is a personal favorite Pale Saints track of mine. This would make my list of top 5 favorite Pale Saints songs. And then the EP concludes with Mother Might, which is a much more experimental track that's noisy but also minimalistic in its instrumentation, with acoustic guitar, bass, vocals, and some ambient background parts that make for a very eerie and haunting mood. And it closes out this EP in such a cool way and really leaves the listener wondering where they're going to go next. They show us a few different styles and flavors that they are dabbling in on this EP, and they do all of it very effectively, and it resulted in 3 amazing tracks that I think stand the test of time throughout the Pale Saints discography. And like I said, it contains one of my favorite Pale Saints songs with She Rides the Waves. So I love this EP. I cannot say enough good things about it. I think they knocked it out of the park with their first release, and this one gets an easy S. Alright, next we have their debut studio album from 1990 titled The Comforts of Madness, and this one will also get an S. An amazing debut record that has so much depth to it and music that is incredibly unique and hard to categorize, giving us this really unique fusion of dream pop, indie rock, noise rock, and shoegaze, which makes for a very enjoyable album with all sorts of twists and turns from track to track, which keeps things very engaging. They do a great job of taking some of the styles that they had established on their prior EP and really expand off of those styles and go into even more uncharted territory. The album is 11 tracks long, and it kicks things off with Way the World Is, which is an amazing track that brings things in very nicely and showcases their unique writing style right away, with the unorthodox drum groove that uses very minimal cymbals against the driving bass line with layered acoustic and electric guitars on top of it. And from that point on, they deliver one amazing and unique song after the next, with some more musically intricate, hard-hitting tracks like You Tear the World in Two, True Coming Dream, and Insubstantial. And we also have some indie pop flavors on this record on tracks like Language of Flowers, Fell from the Sun, and Sight of You, which was a track that they had re-recorded from the previous EP. We also have a couple of more stripped down tracks with Little Hammer, A Deep Sleep for Steven, and we have the beautifully placed ballad Sea of Sound coming in on track 3, which gives us a nice peaceful and serene track to balance out the opening 2 songs and function as a nice palate cleanser for the remainder of the record. And Time Thief is an awesome closing track, a very unique song that takes all sorts of twists and turns with varying instrumentations and tempo and feel changes. A song that perfectly encapsulates the unique elements of Pale Saint's writing, and an incredible track to conclude this awesome record with. My personal favorite song on here would have to be You Tear the World in Two, and this is actually my #1 favorite Pale Saints track of all time. I love everything about this song, the very unique guitar parts, the drum groove and time signature changes, the colorful and moody vocal melody, and the contrasting feel changes between sections. Just a perfect song that encapsulates everything that's so unique about Pale Saint's writing style. So I think this was an incredibly ambitious album, and it features such a beautiful blend of so many different musical worlds, and resulted in an album that I think was a very important contribution to the music of the year 1990. And I think for anyone who is looking to explore dream pop, shoegaze, and indie pop, this album should be required listening. So an amazing first studio album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, moving on, we have their second EP from 1990 titled Half-Life, and I will give this one an A. This is a very solid EP with a couple of really incredible tracks, but I would regard it as a slight downgrade from the previous 2 releases, which to be fair are very hard EPs and albums to follow. But in between Comforts of Madness and this EP, the band had recruited Muriel Barham from the band Lush to do guitar and vocals, which would add some additional varieties and textures to the Pale Saints sound, and I think this was a very positive addition to the group, and this is the first EP that she is performing on. It's 4 tracks long, and I absolutely love the way it opens up with Half-Life Remembered, a song with beautiful guitar parts and layers, really dreamy vocals with beautiful background parts from Muriel, adding a whole new layer of depth to these songs. And this track would make my top 5 favorite Pale Saints song list. I do not think they could have opened this EP on a stronger track. And then it goes into another incredible song titled Baby Maker, which is a hard-hitting song with lots of cool guitar tones going on. The very washy and big-sounding distorted guitars, contrasted by the sections with the clean guitars with effects on top of them, make for a very cool and moody track. So as far as the beginning half of this EP goes, I think it's absolutely perfect. And then for me, the momentum does dip down a little bit on the next 2 tracks. Still not bad songs by any stretch, I just don't resonate with them as much as the opening 2 tracks. It continues with Two Sick Sisters, which is the experimental track of this EP, very similar to Mother Might from the first EP. This song has some wild synth sequences being sparsely used against a very minimalistic instrumentation that the vocals sing over. And again, similar to Mother Might, a very haunting ambient and experimental track that showcases another side to Pale Saint's writing style. And then the EP concludes with A Revelation, which is a pretty good song, but for me personally, in the grand scheme of Pale Saint's EPs and albums, I wouldn't say that this is a song that really stands out to me, especially in comparison to the first 2 tracks. So in general, I tend to think that the first 2 songs of this EP are absolutely perfect, and then Two Sick Sisters is a good song. I wouldn't say that I resonate with it as much as Mother Might if I'm comparing it to the other, more ambient experimental track from the first EP. And A Revelation is a fine song, but I don't find myself going back to it very often, and I wouldn't regard it as one of their stronger tracks from the first half of their discography. So ultimately, those 2 reasons are why I didn't give this an S. But regardless of that, this EP still contains 2 tracks that are absolutely incredible, one of which makes my top 5 favorite Pale Saints song list, and Baby Maker would most likely be on my top 10 list as well. And having 2 songs of that high quality on a 4-track EP is a very impressive thing to pull off, so it certainly has some incredible moments and delivers some timeless Pale Saints tracks, and I regard this as a very good EP, so I will give this one an A. Okay, next we have their third EP from 1991 titled Flesh Balloon, and I will also give this one an A. Another very solid EP with lots of variety and depth to it. It's 4 tracks long, and it opens up with the amazing track Hunted, which would be my personal favorite song on here, and another track that would make my top 10 favorite Pale Saints song list. A rock solid song that gives us something that would be in a similar stylistic territory to Comforts of Madness, and then that is followed up by Porpoise, which is the one track from this EP that I could do without, and is ultimately why I put this in A tier instead of S tier. It's sort of like an instrumental synth-heavy funk sort of track that stylistically doesn't really resonate with me, and I would have been completely fine if this track had just been left off of the EP altogether. But then we go into Kinky Love, which is a very pretty dream pop song with beautiful vocal melodies from Mariel, and this was her first lead vocal track with Pale Saints, which obviously went over very well and resulted in a timeless and classic Pale Saints track that I think is one of the highlights of this EP. Then the EP concludes with a demo of a song called Hair Shoes, which is a very spacey song that is both dreamy and haunting at the same time, and including one experimental track on each EP has been a theme that Pale Saints have kept up since barging into the presence of God. And of those experimental tracks, this one would have to be my favorite. I just love the way the vocals are recorded and mixed, and all of the additional layers of sounds on top of this adds so much suspense and eeriness to this track, and it's just such a cool way to wrap up this amazing EP. So from a consistency standpoint, I do think this EP is a little more consistent than Half-Life, but if we're talking individual standout songs, I do think Half-Life is a bit stronger in that regard. But Porpoise is the only thing that takes anything away from this EP for me. I could have done without that track, but other than that, I love the contrasting moods and feels of Hunted, Kinky Love, and Hair Shoes. And Kinky Love is a beautiful first lead vocal feature for Mariel. So an amazing EP with one track that I think hurts it a tiny bit, but it's still very strong regardless. So I will give this one an A. All right, next we have their second studio album from 1992 titled In Ribbons, and this gets an easy S. Incredible record, and for me, this one goes down as my favorite Pale Saints studio album. On this album, we see a lot of things happening. In my opinion, the addition of Mariel enhances everything even more. Her vocal contributions all throughout this are fabulous, and on here, the band is taking even more chances and venturing further into more unexplored territories, and I think they knock it out of the park. From front to back, this record is just so enjoyable. It's got 12 tracks, and it kicks things off with Throwing Back the Apple, which is an awesome opener, continuing on a similar trajectory to Comforts of Madness, with the very colorful chord progressions in the clean guitars, with interesting grooves and time signature changes going on, some nice background vocals from Mariel later on in the track as well, and from that point on we get a very wide range of palettes, with some other tracks that resemble that Comforts of Madness territory with songs like Ordeal and Baby Maker. We have a couple of more ambient and stripped down songs with Shell, Neverending Night, and Hair Shoes, which is one of 2 songs that were re-recordings of tracks on the previous EP, with the other one being Hunted. And we have multiple songs on here with Mariel on lead vocals, all of which I think are absolutely spectacular and incredibly unique songs, with Thread of Light, Liquid, and Feather Frame. 2 of my favorite tracks from this album are Thread of Light and Liquid, so I consider the Mariel tracks to be key contributors to this record. My other favorite tracks on here would have to be Baby Maker and Hunted. And I always struggle picking a number 1 favorite song from this record because there are so many great ones. But if I had to narrow it down and pick a number 1, I would probably go with Thread of Light. But there are some serious bangers all throughout this track listing, and I love the directions they decided to go in throughout this album. Of all of the Pale Saints albums, this one would contain the largest amount of my favorite songs of theirs, and I think it contains some of the strongest work of their entire discography, and the addition of Mariel doing lead vocals on a couple of tracks I think also adds further enhancement to this already incredible music that was being developed. So this is my favorite Pale Saints album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their fourth and final EP from 1994 titled Fine Friend, and I will give this an A. This was an EP that I hadn't listened to in quite a while prior to making this video, and I had thought that I disliked it more than I actually did because when I went back and re-listened to it, I was very pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed this. After In Ribbons was released, Ian Masters would leave the group in 1993 due to wanting to go into different directions in his music career, and they would add Colleen Brown as the new bassist and would leave Mariel as the main vocalist. And this EP features 4 songs, all of which I think are fine songs, in particular the opening 2 tracks, starting out with Fine Friend, which is a beautiful dream pop track and would be the big song to come out of this EP. Just a very solid pop song to come out of the mid-90s that perfectly encapsulates everything that was great about that period of time in music. And then track 2 would be my personal favorite, titled Special Present, which gets heavier and much more intricate and experimental from a musical perspective, with varying moods ranging from tense to beautiful to hard-hitting and aggressive. Just an incredibly unique and dynamic song that would be my personal favorite track from this EP. Then we go into a spacey and ambient track titled Marimba, which has some really beautiful and serene vocal melodies, and does a great job of contrasting the opening 2 songs. The EP then concludes with Reprise, which is a very stripped down and euphoric track, with one vocal line that continuously gets repeated, saying, "I'll never walk into your arms," and it's a very pretty closer to this very solid EP. I do really miss Ian on here, and that's really the only critique I can give this EP. But in the absence of Ian, I do think the group did a great job of picking up the pieces and delivered a very solid batch of tracks that still contain some flavors of the Pale Saints sound that had been developed when Mariel joined the group, but also ventures into some different territories that make this record its own unique thing in the Pale Saints discography. So in a perfect world, I would have rather had Ian never leave the group and have them do a continuation off of In Ribbons, but in the absence of Ian, I do think they still did a great job with this EP. And even though it is often overshadowed by all of the other great stuff to come before it, I think this EP definitely holds its own in the Pale Saints discography. So I will give this one an A. Okay, and lastly, we have their third and final studio album from 1994 titled Slow Buildings, and I will give this a B. This was a tough album for me to score because I do think there is some really great stuff on here, but at the same time, if I am comparing it to everything else from the Pale Saints discography, this would definitely be my least favorite record of theirs, but it didn't feel right putting it in A tier with other records that I do think are better, so I bumped it down 1 tier, but regardless of that, this is certainly not a bad album by any stretch. Stylistically, this one contains an interesting fusion of alternative rock, as well as some elements of post-rock and experimental rock on select tracks, and obviously with the absence of Ian, a lot of this record sounds much different from the first 3 EPs and the previous 2 studio albums, and as far as stylistic preferences go, I would prefer the pairing of Ian and Mariel as opposed to, Ian being absent from the record, but in the absence of Ian, I do think that this album still managed to produce some really solid stuff. It opens up with King Fade, which is an ambient, mostly instrumental track that progressively builds up more and more, and in my opinion, this is not the strongest track that they could have opened this album with. I wouldn't say it's a song that really brings me in and makes me wonder where the album is going to go next, but luckily as the album continues, we get some better songs like track 2 titled Angel, Will You Be My, which is an awesome alt-rock song that sounds much different stylistically from previous Pale Saints releases, but would be one of the standout songs from this record. And of the alt-rock songs on this record, I would say that this is the strongest track within that stylistic territory. For me personally though, I do tend to resonate most with the darker tracks on here like Henry and Song of Solomon. Henry would be my favorite track on here. I really love the wide use of dynamics and how they really take their time and let the song develop. And a good handful of the songs on here are on the longer side and are more stretched out. Some other standout tracks for me would be the re-recording of Fine Friend, as well as Always I, and the closing track, Suggestion, which has some really beautiful vocal melodies and wraps up the album on a very melancholy sort of mood. And while I do really enjoy all of the songs songs that I just listed, I wouldn't say that any of these would make my list of favorite Pale Saints tracks, so that's another reason as to why I bumped it down to B tier. It's just so hard when you're going up against all of the other incredible music that they recorded with Ian, as well as the previous Fine Friend EP, which I tend to resonate with a bit more than I do with this album. But like I said, regardless of the absence of Ian, they still managed to put out a solid final record that I am glad exists and has plenty of great tracks that I love to go back and revisit. So a good final album, I will give this a B. Alright, we did it. We went through their 3 studio albums and 4 EPs, and this is what I came up with. This is a band that has a really consistent discography from front to back. Not one bad EP and not one bad studio album, in my opinion. And seeing the development and progression of their sound over the course of their discography is something really fascinating to watch play out. And when it comes to shoegaze, dream pop, indie rock, noise rock, and all of the styles in between those, I think it is undeniable that Pale Saints has been a key contributor to all of those styles of music and have left behind some truly unique and timeless music that is unlike any other group to come out at that time. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 3 albums and 4 EPs. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.